And following up the demonstration and review of the theoretical underpinnings of classical conditioning, I think it's pretty important to follow up with just a few examples. That way you can see classical conditioning in context. So let's say you're given this example. Every time someone flushes a toilet in the apartment building, the shower becomes very hot and causes a person to jump back. Over time, the person begins to jump back automatically after hearing the flush before the water temperature changes. So one of the ways you can approach an applied question like this, especially referencing classical conditioning, is that you can ask yourself, what is the stimulus that stays consistent? And in an unconditioned stimulus is hot water. What would happen if exposed to hot water? That will get you to your unconditioned response, which is jumping back. And then you can look to this experience and identify what might actually be neutral to jumping back. Like, would you jump back if you heard a toilet flush? That's how we identify what our neutral stimulus is. And remember that neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus in our formula. And then finally, our conditioned response, of course, is jumping back. But remember that it's important to clearly state that you're jumping back in response to the flushing of the toilet in order to identify it as the conditioned response. I'm going to go ahead and give you a few seconds to look at the next example. Feel free to pause. I'm going to go on and explain it, but it'd be beneficial for you to pause right now and just try to answer the questions yourself. You want to be able to identify what is the unconditioned stimulus, what's the unconditioned response, what's the neutral stimulus, what's the conditioned stimulus, and what's the conditioned response. So if you eat a new food and then you get sick because of the flu, however, you develop a dislike for the food and feel nauseated whenever you smell it. The unconditioned stimulus is the flu, and what you experience in response to the flu is nausea, and sometimes you might actually vomit and feel sick. The neutral stimulus, also the conditioned stimulus, is the new food that you've added to this relationship. So your conditioned response is going to be nausea to the new food in this relationship. One of the cool things about this phenomenon is that it actually has a name. It's called the Garcia effect. This is one of our old, non-old white dudes. He identified this phenomenon in working with rats who had gotten sick from medicine. And his research has actually influenced how cancer treatment occurs and how people try to maintain weight through their chemotherapy, because oftentimes there's lots of nausea and sickness. So what they try to do is they create a food or a taste experience that is unlike anything that they would traditionally have. It's not gross, but it's a really unique chemical composition, and they expose themselves to that. That way they associate feeling nauseous or sick to that really novel taste rather than to any of the food that they would normally expose themselves to. Well, here's another example, and remember to pause this once we flip up the example so you can try to answer the questions yourselves. An individual receives frequent injections of a drug, which are administered in a small examination room at a clinic. The drug itself causes increased heart rate, but after several trips to the clinic, simply being in a small room causes an increased heart rate. First, we have our unconditioned stimulus, which are drug injections, and those drug injections, the unconditioned response is the accelerated heart rate. Now the novel, the new, or the neutral item that has been added and becomes conditioned is the small room. And what occurred in this example is that the individual developed a conditioned response of an accelerated heart rate in response to a room. But you'll notice that the very last sentence, the last part of the final sentence says, simply being in a small room causes an increased heart rate. What happened for this individual is they'd actually generalized, and that it became less about that specific small examination room at the clinic, and it started to become about all small rooms. Okay, well, that's it for examples for now. Until next